British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is floundering. Just over a year after he won a landslide election victory, he's found himself with an approval rating of minus 43, which is not good, just to clarify. He has also this week seen a massive revolt in the House of Commons, where even some of his massive supporters generally rebelled against the Labour Party whip to vote against a welfare bill which stood to significantly cut financial aid the government gives to disabled people. And if that wasn't enough, can I find... If none of that was enough, even those in the press who usually are some of his biggest supporters seem to be questioning his performance. The New Statesman here, granted, a piece here at the top written by Aaron Bastani from Novara Media, not a go-to supporter of Keir Starmer. But if you roll down their latest pieces in the New Statesman about the Labour Party, you get a litany of pieces about how the Keir Starmer project is maybe not going as well as it could be. I mean, even Rachel Cunliffe, who... do we think she's got something to put a positive spin to put on Keir Starmer? No. Okay. So just to clarify, if you're watching not from within the UK, the New Statesman is effectively brewed from the same sort of stem cells as Keir Starmer's politics as Prime Minister. We'll get to how his politics might have changed over the years shortly. But the New Statesman should be an absolute layup for Keir Starmer, right? This should be just mixed metaphors. This should be just to tap it in. He should be able to count on the New Statesman as a kind of centre-left, pragmatic Labour Party magazine. If Keir Starmer has lost the New Statesman, something is not going particularly well. And so I thought we might take this opportunity together to explore the rise and maybe fall of Keir Rodney Starmer. JJ Wave saying Pod Save the UK just did an interview with the editor of the New Statesman, Tom McTague. He looked like talking about Starmer made him want to cry. Yeah, so Tom McTague, I don't know if I'll be able to find it, did a piece where he sort of followed Keir Starmer around. Oh, here it was. So one of these pieces where a magazine sends a reporter to kind of shadow a politician or celebrity or someone on the road for a little bit and then to kind of write up their experiences. This was Tom McTague, who was the new editor of the New Statesman, did a piece where he did that with Keir Starmer. Now, I will say, maybe one of the reasons that the Starmer project fails to get its messaging across is that in 2025, it thinks that one of the ways to turn the ship around is by giving an exclusive sort of long-term interview follow-along experience to the New Statesman, a magazine which I'm presumably is still turning a profit, right? I'm sure presumably is still going. However, maybe, he's not even going on like the rest is politics as far as I've seen, which would at least be something. I think that would still be sort of preaching largely to Westminster, but it would be something. All of which is to say, Keir Starmer, come on the show. But Tom McTague, new editor of the New Statesman, will so have wanted to write a good piece about Keir Starmer, and yet sort of what we got was a thing about how Keir Starmer's kind of a sad boy, and he really feels things and struggles to express himself, which is sort of an interesting character study. But I sort of don't care if the Prime Minister's a sad boy. Like, I don't know. Interesting character study of a person. Just maybe not super kind of, I don't know. Do I wish things for him personally are going well and that he is happy in his life? Maybe. Don't know how much that relates to his sort of political project. And so, I wanted to rewind the clock a little bit and to see if we could go back through the many twists and turns of the career and politics of Sir Keir Rodney Starmer. I can't even say it. Sir Keir Rodney Starmer, KC. Because it's been an interesting career. And I want to see if we can try and work out what went wrong along the way. Not another gamer says, I hope we find out what his father did for work. Maybe we'll get there. Okay, so I want to start with this video.
We pride ourselves on having a legal system which is the best in the world, and we pride ourselves on the fact that we've all got free speech. But in reality, of course, that simply isn't the situation.
You don't get free lawyers.
So this is a kind of young Keir Starmer. I want to say like late 20s, early 30s? I'm trying to think. This is 1990, this is 162. I'm going to do maths. No, so mid-30s. This is kind of mid-30s Keir Starmer.
Raising all sorts of issues.
And this is as soon as I saw him making an appearance in a film directed by Ken Loach and Penny somebody, I believe. Called McLibel. So this is a film about a couple of environmental activists who effectively printed some leaflets, making some complaints about... printed some leaflets, making some accusations about McDonald's. Some of which may or may not have been true, but their impact on people's health, their impact on the way in which they advertise to children, their environmental impact. And kind of as they tell it in this documentary, they effectively printed a few hundred leaflets and handed them out in the street. In response, McDonald's sued them for libel. And effectively what happened is there was a bunch of activists. Most of them were like, yeah, okay, we'll stop doing it and apologise. And a couple of them were just like, nah, we'll go for it. You know, we'll sort of see you in court kind of thing. And so these couple of activists spent the best part of a decade. So I think it was the longest libel case in British history. So in the best part of a decade, representing themselves in court, fighting in this great kind of David and Goliath face-off against McDonald's, in what became a kind of reasonably renowned trial. I mean, it just went on for ages, so it sort of had time to pick up traction. But as they went on, they gradually began to get some kind of pro bono support from legal experts and lawyers, one of whom was Keir Starmer. Pretend name saying this has made me realise how badly I've aged. Do you know what? He's aged well, I think. I think we can, particularly given, if you really want to see how, kind of, get a sense of how long ago this film was made, it is the most 1990s documentary you've ever seen. There's some great graphics, I think, just here. Like, how great is that? That's so... It's very, like, brass eye. And so Keir Starmer has this kind of... His origin story, I guess, is of him as this human rights lawyer. And this kind of gets talked... Or at least got talked about previously. These days it tends to work against him more than anything. But he spent many years doing human rights work. not only in the UK, but also around the world. So he spent a bunch of time working for a project called the Death Penalty Project, which basically doesn't so much campaign... Well, I assume it also does some campaigning against the existence of the death penalty around the world, but particularly goes to countries which have the death penalty and gives people lawyers for free to defend them against being put to death by the state. And so Keir Starmer spends a lot of his career sort of going around the world to defend people who have done horrific crimes, and who have been sort of put on their country's death row, and defending them, kind of on this, quite high-minded principle, practical principle as well, of, no state should have the ability to dish out death as a punishment. And by this point, he's already kind of had one pivot already. Some of you will know that before he was famous, Keir Starmer had this kind of slightly radical past. Most famously, he'd been on the editorial board of a magazine called Socialist Alternatives. But Socialist Alternatives was kind of the official organ of the International Marxist Revolutionary Society. Sorry, the International Revolutionary Marxist Tendency. And Keir Starmer sat on it's kind of a Trotskyist group, which sought to, as many Trot groups do, kind of bend the Labour Party to its will, effectively. And in fact, at one point, as this article in the Social Review says, wrote of the Labour Party that we would be better to go forward to rebuild and develop the party as an instrument of socialism, capable of integrating into its project the emergence of the new social movements of the last 20 years, rather, as he kind of says in other words here, stick to a kind of more pragmatic, centrist kind of triangulation. And so by the time he was kind of Keir Starmer, the lawyer, he had already done a bit of a pivot. He'd started off wanting to kind of very much tear the system down, and had gradually got to a point where, he'd found what I'm sure he felt was a kind of middle ground of managing to work within the system to defend people from overreaches of the state. Whether that was the McLibel case, where he felt that both McDonald's and the British state were giving too much power to people with money over people who kind of wanted to express some thoughts about a thing, or whether that was going to other countries and defending people against having the death penalty put upon them. And then he had another, maybe more subtle pivot. In 2008, he takes something of a sidestep from being a defense barrister, so someone who is primarily defending people who have been accused of crimes in court, and, at the very least making sure that they get to have their say and get to have their side put across. At the very best, presumably, making sure they get to go home rather than go to prison. In 2008, he takes a sidestep to go and work for the other side. And he became Director of Public Prosecutions, which is effectively the job of being in charge of the Crown Prosecution Service, which in the UK is the body which decides whether, when, and how to prosecute people for crimes. And so sometimes it might decide not to, if, I don't know. So there'll be times when someone does a crime and the CPS will be like, we don't have enough evidence to take that to court. Or they might go, it's not in the public interest to take this to court. Or they might go, let's take this to court in this certain way. Oh, sorry, Serial Chick saying CPS only has jurisdiction in England and Wales. Thank you very much. That is very true. Scotland has a slightly different legal system. And that obviously brings, that is obviously a different job. You go from being the person that is defending people who may or may not have done crimes, but you are defending people from the power of the state to being in charge of it. And that means that this track record is a little bit patchier, right? However, so one of the more controversial ones was that following the 2011 riots, largely in London, but which later spread throughout England, Keir Starmer, then in charge of the CPS, decides to implement like 24-hour courts to kind of prosecute as many people as they can, to kind of really crack down on this and kind of like restore order in the wake of these riots. And there's this really keen sense of trying to make sure that anyone who did anything is prosecuted. However, within that, again, there are also kind of more positive prosecutions that happen with that, like ones that are much harder to argue against, I guess. He was in charge of prosecuting the murderers of Stephen Lawrence back in 2000-ish. MP's expenses scandal. So there was a big scandal in the UK in which basically it was found that most politicians were kind of playing fast and loose with the rules with regard to their expenses. And, the famous stories were people that would claim expenses for like a bottle of milk, which was felt to be ridiculous. Or there was I think Tory MP who claimed for a duck house. Sorry, a duck island. I've undersold that. So Peter Viggers. Oh, so this is his obituary. Oh, okay. Which this goes to show quite how big of a story this was. That his obituary describes him as Duck Island Expenses Claim MP. What a way to be remembered. Oh god, what a way to go. And then for it to be a photo of you and then a photo of the duck house. But yeah, this ended up being kind of like one of the big symbols of kind of MPs kind of taking the piss with their expenses. The idea being that the expenses existed to furnish your home, and then there would be some MPs who'd be like, oh yeah, every home needs a duck island. And then in 2015, a seat becomes available for the Labour Party in St Pancras and Holborn. St Pancras and Holborn, which Keir Starmer's seat, it's a very London seat, and it's a very like central London seat. So it includes King's Cross, which is, Google's based there. It's the train station from Harry Potter. It includes Camden Town, I think, or at least some of it. It also, whatever's in the middle here. Presumably also, like, the British Library, I assume, would also get in there. I don't know whether the Wellcome Collection quite gets in. It's sort of this, like, slither. A lot of MPs don't have many any sort of national landmarks within their seat, They try and, or, like, maybe they've got one, or they've got a very local landmark, which they're then like, hey, everyone, you should recognise this. I'm very proud to be here. Keir Starmer has loads of them. But effectively what happens is the MP retires, I believe, and Keir Starmer stands for the seat, and it's a very safe seat. And therefore, he wins it. And Keir Starmer first winning his seat as an MP is a kind of odd experience in that Starmer wins his seat. However, the Labour Party more broadly loses. This is the election in which Ed Miliband,
a bloke on the tube, said to me
is asked whether he's tough enough.
Ed Miliband goes into a room with Vladimir Putin. The door is closed. 2 minutes later, the door is opened again, and Vladimir Putin is standing there smiling, and Ed Miliband is all over the floor in pieces.
Was that David Cameron who you met on the tube?
No, it wasn't. I don't think he uses the tube very much. But
that's rather unfair to him, I think.
It is unfair.
Yeah.
But you understand what the point is here. The point is people think you...
I can't get across the extent to which Ed Miliband was sold to us as not being very charismatic, And I actually think when you compare Ed Miliband and Keir Starmer, Ed Miliband is kind of a sort of charm magnet.
Just not tough enough.
Well, let me tell you, right? Let me tell you. Okay.
Come on.
Let me tell you. Okay, in the summer of 2013, this government proposed action in Syria, the bombing of Syria, right? I was called into a room by David Cameron and Nick Clegg because President Obama had been on the phone, the leader of the free world, right? I listened to what they said, and over those days I made up my mind and we said no, right? Now, I think standing up to the leader of the free world, I think shows a certain toughness, I would
proud
say.
of what's happened in Syria since?
I'm not proud of it, no. It's a failure of the international community. But what I'm not going to do is repeat the mistakes of the 2003 Iraq War, which happened when Labour was in power, which is a rush to war without knowing what your strategy is and without being clear about what the consequences would be. I'm not a pacifist, so I did support action in Libya, and David Cameron talked about how I supported action against ISIS. But am I tough enough? Hell yes, I'm tough enough.
Oh, his big mistake was just be like, that's not my style, you know? In fact, I'm sort of a big critic of politicians' social media accounts, which Keir Starmer is terrible at. Maybe we'll get to that later. Ed Miliband, absolutely smashing it on TikTok. He just does sort of really fun TikToks, and he sort of embraces, he's like now embraces the fact that he's kind of a bit dorky, as someone was saying in the chat. But so Keir Starmer gets his safe seat, but Ed Miliband here, unfortunately, is not tough enough to win the election. The Labour Party, I think, loses a few seats. It doesn't go well, and it was one of those elections where it looked like it really could have. It looked like it really could have gone Labour's way, and it just didn't. And so Ed Miliband resigns, and something which had completely gone over my head that I'd never seen at the time. Immediately after Keir Starmer is elected as an MP, like he's been an MP for days, Ed Miliband resigns, and on Twitter there is a Twitter storm. I don't know if any of you can remember the concept of a Twitter storm, which was where lots of people could sign up to like sort of schedule a tweet, and if you got enough people to sign up to schedule either like the same tweet or tweets with a particular hashtag, it would then sort of send them all out at the same time with the idea that you would get a particular hashtag trending, and that everyone would be like, whoa, oh my goodness, everyone's talking about X. Well, someone tried to organise a Twitter storm for hashtag Keir for Leader. And I was kind of fascinated reading this story, because as far as I can tell, it was about 1,000 people, which is not particularly like a lot of people, but some of them were kind of establishment enough that it got noticed, and it got written up in multiple papers, and he even responded to it, despite how sort of marginal this was, by saying, I'm also very surprised that Keir Starmer has not deleted any of his tweets. Flattered by hashtag Keir for Leader initiative, and thanks for so many supportive messages, but Labour needs S/1, someone. This dates this very much, with more political experience. Serial Chicks has 9 days from his return. Like, this is a man who, I don't even know if he'd sorted his swipe card out by this point. And yet, there were sort of enough people within this kind of like establishment bubble that were like, oh yeah, Keir Starmer, the former director of public prosecutions. Which, to clarify, in case you're watching from elsewhere, people don't know who the director of public prosecutions is. This is not like a famous role. Who is it at the moment? Stephen Parkinson. Like, no one is going around talking about Stephen Parkinson outside of people who kind of exist within the kind of political bubble, right? No shade on Stephen Parkinson brackets lawyer, but that's just not a thing that happens. Just sort of no one, like, there's no Stephen Parkinson fandom. Most people simply do not know who this guy is. And so anyone who was doing hashtag Keir for leader because they knew that he'd been like a very pragmatic director of public prosecutions, whatever, was like a very specific kind of person. And I do think it says maybe something about Keir Starmer that he took it upon himself to rule himself out, right? That he thought, this is a thing that I need to respond to. Because if there's one thing that we're going to keep going back to, it's that Keir Starmer has sort of technically won quite a lot of elections, but often sort of by default. And I think this is a good kind of flash forward of what might have happened in 2024, where he again won an election sort of by default, is that I wonder whether he thought he hasn't won by default and maybe was a lot more popular than he was. However, Ed Miliband resigns, and who comes along in his place? But Jeremy Corbyn.
See that far?
So,
Look on the...
we get this big moment where Jeremy Corbyn's at Glastonbury. We get sort of Corbyn mania for a bit. Keir Starmer actually nominates Andy Burnham, who is sort of a left-leaning figure within the Labour Party, who was like reasonably well, sort of tipped to do reasonably well in the leadership election, and had Jeremy Corbyn not got enough nominations to get on the ballot for that leadership election, I won't go too much into the specifics of how that all works, Andy Burnham would have probably been sort of the left candidate in that election. What actually happens is that Jeremy Corbyn gets onto the ballot, and lots and lots of people join the Labour Party specifically to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. A lot of people who were already members of the Labour Party kind of actually sort of go, well, we would like to do this leftward shift. And he wins with this kind of, and it's a ranked, it's a sort of, it's not a dissimilar moment to Mamdani in New York, where it's kind of ranked choice voting. I don't know exactly what the specific system is called that's used, but kind of a system where you are expected to go into multiple rounds. And I think I'm right in saying he wins on the first round. He gets 59.5% of first preference votes. So the whole kind of like multiple rounds thing doesn't even end up mattering at all. And so this kind of trucks on for a little while. Keir Starmer becomes a minister within the Home Office department, I think for immigration maybe. But he's like a junior minister, which means you don't have a huge amount of responsibility. But you're kind of there. It's a sort of job you can get some experience in. And so this kind of trucks along for a little while. Keir Starmer's kind of very minor figure in the Labour shadow cabinet. And then there is this big, coup post-Brexit. So some of you might remember this, but basically Brexit happens. The UK votes to leave the EU in the referendum. And there's this big, whether it was orchestrated or whether it kind of just happened all of a sudden. Basically, none of the MPs within the Labour Party particularly liked Jeremy Corbyn. The membership did. And so for a while, they kind of play along with it. But then post-Brexit, they kind of used this idea that Corbyn hasn't been super involved in the Brexit campaign or hasn't been vocal enough or supportive enough of the Remain campaign to kick off a leadership challenge. And so basically Or what they try and do initially is they try and basically all resign to make it impossible for Corbyn to have a complete shadow cabinet, so that he would then have to resign and go, let's do a leadership election. Keir Starmer has this sort of weird involvement in this big coup, in that he's really late to resign. So this is an article in The Guardian about the coup against Jeremy Corbyn. Okay, this was published 26th of June. This is like a retrospective article, how it happened, how it gathered pace. Somewhere on The Guardian, there's like a live blog of it taking place, which ended on Sunday the 26th. 3 p.m. on the 27th, Keir Starmer's like, yes, I also resign. In this kind of weird, like, oh, now sort of I can see which way this is going. I also am taking part. But then you read the letter and it's really like equivocating, and it's like, I don't dislike you. I'm really sad about this. I'm sorry, but I've got to resign. It's kind of a really, we need a much louder voice on the critical issues of renegotiating the UK's place in the world and mitigating the damaging impact of our exit from the EU. Serial tricksing, hedging, weather vane stuff. Yeah, he sort of waits until it's clear what's happened before he then joins in almost retrospectively. As we've sort of flash forwarded to already, this big coup fails. Well, they managed to bring about a leadership election. What happens is Corbyn wins again with a larger percentage of the vote than he had the first time round. And things are a little bit more fractious between him and the MPs in the Labour Party. So previously there've been a lot of people who had opposed Jeremy Corbyn who went into the shadow cabinet. When they come back, they sort of refuse to do so. Most of them, at least, because someone who doesn't refuse to do so is Keir Starmer. So here he is in 2016. In actual fact, Starmer does quite well out of the whole coup and leadership election thing, because he goes from being, within 2 years of being a member of parliament, goes from being an MP to being a junior shadow minister to being shadow Brexit secretary. And of course, this is a really not only important but high profile role over the next bunch of years, because Brexit is happening and everybody is talking about Brexit and what each party's Brexit policy is, and the Tories are trying to do their thing and Labour's criticising it. And so he becomes more and more of a key figure, more and more of a kind of high-profile figure on the news, etc. He also sort of comes across quite well during this period, I think, because the Tories' approach to Brexit is like super chaotic, and he manages to, as he still does these days, kind of project that veneer of being someone who is competent. I would say that's kind of fallen apart a little bit now, but at least at this point, he's very good at projecting this idea of himself and the things he does as like sensible and competent and sort of bureaucratic, but in a reliable way, which contrasts with the Tories' approach quite well. He also does quite well out of it because Brexit becomes a splinter issue on kind of between the left and liberals. For, I'm sure some people will say, for deep reasons of kind of deep conviction, and I'm sure that was part of it for many people. But if you're a British liberal at this point, and you don't like Jeremy Corbyn already, then the idea that Jeremy Corbyn is not trying to stop Brexit enough is a really good reason to pretend that you don't just not like him because you don't want the top 5% to get taxed, or you don't want the trains to be renationalised, or whatever it is. You can be like, no, I am actually just really anti-Brexit, and that's my reason. I would also say that the rise of sort of British transphobia gets kind of muddled in here as well, where it allows your kind of J.K. Rowlings who don't want to pay more tax, to be like, no, actually, I don't like the Labour Party now because of I guess actually I'm just too much of a feminist. Actually, that's where I'm coming at this from, and so as there becomes this kind of split between British Liberals, particularly the kind of like Alistair Campbells, etc., and the sort of British left, Keir Starmer also finds himself in this place where he can have a foot in both camps, because on the one hand, he is very much in the Labour shadow cabinet. He is building up experience there. He's on TV all the time. He is, someone who already has power. While on the other hand, he gets to talk about Brexit a lot and gets to kind of like oppose it a lot, in a way that when there is the thing, so this is the People's Vote, which was his big campaign, a not successful campaign at all. It was very good at getting people who already had opposed Brexit before Brexit happened to go out and go on marches. It wasn't particularly... and it was sort of very good at telling everyone that there were lots of people out there who would change their minds. I don't think it was very good at convincing people who had voted for Brexit that not only should we have another referendum, but they should vote differently, like getting them on board. I mean, Serial Chick saying Corbyn let that split happen, though he could have owned Remain. Sort of Remain was never going to happen. I think the policy to go with was always going to be, okay, let's do Brexit, but let's do it in a way that is protects workers' rights, that protects freedom of movement, and to kind of own that narrative. Never going to happen that you could just overturn the result. And I think it would have been really justifiable for people who had voted for Brexit to then go, well, why did we have the referendum in the first place? I think, there's a lot of arguments at the time about if this was like an advisory vote, or the vote should have been done in a different way so that it needed like a 2/3 majority or something. But if that because that hadn't been laid out before, I think as someone who would have liked us not to have left the EU, I think you would have really struggled to have made that argument to the electorate in such a way that you could sort of get people who had voted for Brexit on board with that. I think if that had been the system already, that could have worked. I think adding a bunch of additional kind of like terms and caveats around it after the fact would not have gone down very well. I don't think. We kind of already have a sort of political crisis in terms of like the legitimacy of the government, whoever is in power. I don't know whether you would have pulled that one off. And so what eventually happens is that Starmer in particular kind of pushes the Labour Party towards this policy, and this is kind of into the election, pushes the Labour Party towards this policy of having a second referendum. So the Labour Party, during the 2019 general election, the Labour Party policy around Brexit becomes that there's going to be a second referendum on Brexit, that kind of maybe enough has changed that we can have another vote, but that Corbyn's going to kind of become neutral in it. The whole thing is a terrible policy. It's a terrible attempt to try and hold all of these various things together, that kind of ends up pleasing no one. And yet enough of the blame for that ends up on Corbyn, sort of rightly or wrongly, that Keir Starmer ends up coming out of it as, maybe the guy that was on board with all the other stuff, but maybe also the guy that had done the most kind of to stop Brexit happening. And so kind of British Liberals kind of get won over again by him. And so Corbyn resigns. And there is another Labour leadership election. And going into it, there is a certain logic that the person who is going to be the next leader of the Labour Party should be a woman. There has never been a woman Labour Prime Minister in the UK. And that they should be from outside London. because Brexit has kind of made clearer this fracture between London and the regions, and it's kind of deemed to be a good idea that the next leader should be someone from outside of London, probably from the north, to kind of be able to be a party that is for the whole country, particularly this sort of idea that Remainers, but also the Labour Party, are kind of very London-centric. When the leadership election happens, there are three main candidates. There one more? Someone didn't make it? Emily Thornberry also... So Clive Lewis and Jess Phillips pulled out early. Can't remember what happened to Jess Phillips. Jess Phillips was would have had loads of support within the certainly amongst MPs, and I think she just kind of very quickly dropped out, and I can't remember exactly why. Emily Thornberry couldn't get enough nominations, I think, to get on the ballot. And to the sort of three candidates when it actually comes to the voting, Keir Starmer, Lisa Nandy, Rebecca Long-Bailey. Emily Thornberry was in it for quite some time. She was certainly in a lot of the debates. And, we go into it with this suggestion that it absolutely needs to be a woman, and it absolutely needs to be someone from outside of London. Both of the other candidates are women from the north of England. Who wins? But Keir Starmer. Someone who could not be more establishment if you tried, right? He is a lawyer who is the ex-person in charge of prosecuting people on behalf of the state, whose constituency includes 7 dials, and King's Cross and Camden Town. Not just London, but bang central in the middle of London. Possibly the British Library, I'm not sure. And so we end up with probably the most establishment, most London candidate amongst them. And he kind of wins the election sort of by being... his pitch is sort of to be Jeremy Corbyn, but maybe a bit more focused on policy. So there was this idea after the 2019 election that one of the reasons that the Labour Party hadn't done very well was that it had too many policies, and that it should have kind of pared those down, that it could have been perceived that it was unachievable to sort of do all of these things at once. And so to be a bit more focused, and also to be a bit more media savvy, right? A bit more media friendly, a bit more better at electioneering. The slogan of his leadership campaign is "Another future is possible." In fact, he has this list of 10 pledges which he posts out to Labour Party members, which are effectively a slightly more focused Corbynism, right? He is really trying to pitch himself as, if you are on the left wing of the Labour Party, which at this point, in this leadership election, is most of the Labour Party at this point, he's you can vote for me, right? Public services should be in public hands. We're going to support common ownership, might be nationalisation, might be some other form of community ownership, but common ownership of rail, mail, energy and water. End outsourcing of the NHS, local government and the justice system. Put the Green New Deal at the heart of everything we do. End the Tories' cruel benefit sanctions regime. Increase income tax on the top 5%. It's a pretty, within the context of British politics, a reasonably radical manifesto of social democracy, right? Repealing the Trade Union Act, which basically made it really hard to go on strike. Defend migrants' rights. An immigration system based on compassion and dignity, right? It's very much not just continuity Corbyn, because it is different, and a lot of people felt like it didn't pass the sniff test. I think it's worth saying that it wasn't the case that he had managed to pick up all of the left-wing supporters, but he did manage to successfully make the argument that he was close enough to Corbyn in terms of policy, and yet good enough at politics that it would be like a good compromise. And so once again, we get another pivot. There's also a second part to his election, his leadership election campaign, where there's also a attempt to kind of do this personality campaigning. One of the things that he posts out to every single member of the Labour Party, which is not a cheap thing to do, because at the time the Labour Party is the largest political party in Europe, he posts out in the physical mail a leaflet, one side of which is just an A3, I want to say, picture of his face. Keir Starmer for leader, integrity, authority, unity. Serial Chick saying 500,000 or 600,000 members, as I recall. I don't think it's quite that many at this point, maybe, but certainly hundreds of thousands of people being sent in the post just a massive photo of his face. Once again, as with hashtag Keir for leader, there's sort of this idea that maybe he's a personality, that maybe people find him charming and cool and magnetic in some way, which I don't know where the sort of evidence for that was, but that's the campaign he runs. And in fact, when he wins, it all happens amid COVID. He has to do his acceptance speech via the internet because it's COVID. But crucially, somewhere in here, he thanks, quote, I think, his friend Jeremy Corbyn.
It is the honour and the privilege of my life to be elected as leader of the Labour Party. It comes at a moment like none other in our lifetime. Coronavirus has brought normal life to a halt. Our cities, our towns and our villages are silent. Our roads deserted. Public life has all but come to a standstill, and we're missing each other. People are frightened by the strangeness, anxious about what will happen next. And we have to remember that every number,
here we go,
and my own amazing campaign team, full of positivity, with that unifying spirit. I want to pay tribute to Jeremy Corbyn, who led our party through some really difficult times, who energised our movement, and who's a friend as well as a colleague. And to all of our members, supporters and affiliates.
So even on winning the leadership, he is, he is still kind of going, there's some continuity there. Maybe not everything, but there is some continuity there. And yet, during that time, between sort of 4 years between him winning the leadership and the election that he eventually goes in to win, he again does a pivot. And his 10 pledges eventually become 5 missions by 2023. And I think I've seen Unlearning Economics somewhere talk about the fact that this idea of missions seems to come from, there's a book about Mariana Mazzucato, who writes about the mission economy. And this is this idea that economies do well when you have a sort of clarifying mission that the state is going to lead on, and maybe it's going to use private companies and private enterprise to help make that happen, but that there's like something that you're doing. So one of the kind of key ideas she picks up on is, or key examples, that she picks up on is the moon landings. And so she's like, throughout those years of the space race, the US government had this thing it really wanted to do, like this mission that was deciding at least some of its policy, where it was like, we want to land on the moon. And through doing that, it was like, cool, well, we need to improve on all of these different technologies, and we need to spend all this money on doing this particular stuff. And like through that process, all kinds of new technologies were invented, and all kinds of like, there were all kind of like economic side benefits to that, which sort of meant that it was worth doing in the long term. And I think it's Carl from Unlearning Economics who was like, Keir Starmer seems like he skimmed that book and been like, yeah, we should also have missions. He talks a lot about missions. And yet his missions aren't really missions. They're kind of, he's just talking about the things that you would think of as being the like side benefits. So like growth in and of itself isn't really a mission. Growth is something that comes as a consequence of doing other stuff. Maybe the green stuff, and the green stuff has got kind of watered down, but like it's a bit more vague. Make Britain a clean energy superpower. Not entirely sure. Actually just getting fossil fuels out of our system, that's not becoming a superpower. If we want to go like, let's invent new technologies, that's a mission. Improving the NHS, reforming the justice system, raising education standards. They become like much vaguer than they had been. And Starmer's argument for this is that all of this isn't some like massive capitulation or massive like swing to the right. His argument is that times have changed, right? That COVID has sort of done a number on the country, and therefore he needs to change what his promises to the country are and what his policies are, which would be easier to follow along with had the leadership election not been in 2020. COVID was kind of already happening by the time the leadership election had happened, and it's not just in substance that the policies end up changing. It is very much in everything about them that is changing. And then, by the time we eventually reach the general election of 2024, all of that stuff has gradually become even more vague to be the slogan change. But Keir Starmer runs on the kind of slogan of change. And I think the model that Keir Starmer would like to say that he had for this election was that he was sort of mimicking Tony Blair in 97. And in fact, sort of things can only get better. The song from 1997 ends up being like a bit of a meme around the election. There's this moment where Rishi Sunak is announcing the election, and there's this like anti-Brexit campaigner called Steve, someone who is his thing is sort of being obnoxious, and he blasts out "Things Can Only Get Better" in the street to drown him out.
That it has not always been easy. Some of you will only just be starting to feel the benefits, and for some, it might still be hard when you look at your bank balance.
However, in reality, I think the key model for this election, well, there's sort of two. The first is Sadiq Khan's first election victory as Mayor of London. Because throughout Sadiq Khan's first campaign, at least, to become Mayor of London, he repeatedly talks about the fact that his dad was a bus driver. For several like reasonably good reasons. It's kind of this down-to-earth, honest, working-class job. It's also a kind of iconic London job, right? London buses are a whole thing. And so being a bus driver is like, not only did he have this hard-working, practical, working-class job, he had a hard-working, practical, working-class job that was like distinctive of London. And so Keir Starmer apes this with his endless just talking about his dad being a toolmaker, which already is this kind of odd recreation of the Sadiq Khan thing, because being a bus driver is a thing that everyone sort of has a really good grasp of what that is. Being a tool maker sort of feels vague. Sort of feels like a made up. Like, I know obviously people make tools, but I don't know. Like, I don't know what that looks like in the day to day. You know, what does it look like to go to work as a tool maker? What does your 9 to 5 look like? Whereas a bus driver, I'm like, yeah, I know what's happening there. And the other model is David Cameron, who, when he ran in 2010, similarly ran on change. Like, there had similarly been 13 years of the Labour Party, in the same way that there have been 14 years of the Tories in 2024. And so actually, kind of change sort of becomes enough to win an election. Just being like, don't these guys look tired? Don't they look like they've had enough and they've run out of ideas? How angry are you at them? And sort of the less that you can say about what you want to do, the better, because you don't want to give people too much that they can not like. So sort of less is more kind of works. But there's a second bit of David Cameron's strategy that Keir Starmer also chooses to borrow, which I think is much more fatal. And that is that when David Cameron and George Osborne first get into number 10, their first thing to do is go, do you know what? Actually, things are really bad, and we're going to have to put the country through hard times to save money. Kind of with the broad sense, both that the idea that kind of Labour had overspent, and also the fact that the global financial crisis had happened, they're kind of like, do you know what? Actually, everything sucks, and we're going to have to make deep cuts, and it's going to be painful, but we're doing it because we're, like, sensible. They're also doing it early enough in the term that they can go, do you know what, in 4 years' time when we have another election, hopefully people will have forgotten about the bad things and will have done a bunch of good stuff. That never quite happens for the Tories. But and so Keir Starmer kind of decides to do a similar thing. And so they win the election on this promise of change. And Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves do just what George Osborne and David Cameron did, and they go, do you know what? We've got into power, and actually the finances are worse than we thought, and we're not going to be able to really do anything. Sucks to be you. We might have to make a bunch of cuts. And it's, on a practical sort of strategic level, a wild decision. But their sort of feeling, I think, is that if they do this early enough on, then they can make some hard decisions and kind of do all of the stuff they want to do that they think people are going to hate. And then they can try and do some good stuff later on. And that by 2029, when the next election is, everyone will have forgotten about the difficult stuff. The challenge is that they largely start doing things that people who are inclined to vote for the Labour Party will absolutely hate. So, for example, very recently, they have tried to push through welfare cuts. We have also seen Keir Starmer, you know, the person that in his 10 pledges wanted to protect migrants' rights, right? To put together a immigration system which kind of was dignified and protected people's dignity as they applied for asylum, whatever it was. He starts doing kind of, his rhetoric becomes about smashing the gangs. He wants to be sort of like tough on, and it's a minor shift from Rishi Sunak is like, stop the boats, the people on the boats are bad. Keir Starmer has slightly different rhetoric of kind of being like, well, the gangs are bad, the gangs are exploiting people. the shift which would make a difference, which would be to a more dignified asylum system, wherein people who are in France now could apply for asylum in the UK so that they don't come across the English Channel in dinghies. That doesn't make an appearance, and in fact, instead, we get a kind of new border control force coming in to kind of look after all this stuff. We get a Keir Starmer who is, as the Byline Times puts it here, kind of swinging to the right to try and capture a voter base which seems more and more supportive of the Reform Party. But he kind of ends up in a strange place where not only has he pivoted so far from, of all of the versions of Keir Starmer that we have seen over the course of this stream, not only is he now so far away from any of those that he's managed to lose, members of his own party along the way. And so many different people that would have supported him at different points have kind of fallen by the wayside. He finds himself in this position where he's trying to chase people who are currently suggesting they're going to vote for Reform, but in such a way where him saying that, it's all about cutting down on immigration and the boats, well, that ends up making people feel like they should vote for Reform, because he's going, yeah, the stuff Reform are talking about, they're pretty, yeah, they're right, actually. Because none of those people kind of trust him to do that stuff, because they simply do not like the Labour Party and simply do not like Keir Starmer. Whilst everyone to his left and to the left, on the left of the Labour Party or to the left of the Labour Party, ends up falling by the wayside because, well, they sort of don't want to go along with this kind of ever more rightward rhetoric, and that's before we even get into the ways in which he's talked about the genocide in Gaza. And one of the flaws, I think, is almost going back to this moment where there seems to be this idea that he might be a personality politician. And going back to that poster of... It's not this, is it? Yeah. Going back to that poster of Keir Starmer where they're like, oh yeah, do you know what? Maybe Keir Starmer can win this on his magnetic personality. I think someone in his team thinks that he might sort of be a personality and that people might warm to him because he's like a sort of cool guy. I think they also seem to be under the impression that despite following the David Cameron playbook of just being like, let's just say change a lot, and hopefully we can pick up on the fact people don't like the Conservatives and just pick up their votes, I think Keir Starmer and his team think they won the last election rather than just benefiting from the fact that people didn't like the Tories. And so we end up, I'm fascinated by sort of Keir Starmer's social media stuff because so much of it is just sort of him in places. So there was a great example of this. So there was a great example of this the other day where this is the official UK Prime Minister Twitter account where they decided to do 1 year in pictures. And it's just sort of Keir Starmer looking moody around 10 Downing Street. In a way that I was just like, I don't know who this is for. Because none of this is like him doing stuff that has changed people's lives. Which, like, there is at least some policies you could point to. It's just kind of Keir Starmer hanging out around the office. And they often do these sort of videos, which are just like moody videos of him kind of hanging out or like doing hard work in a way that sort of feels as though they think he might be this cool personality that people really warm to because he won the last election, right? Whereas actually he was kind of just the guy that sort of caught the bunch of flowers at the wedding because it got thrown away. And all of this has meant that we find ourselves, I said, I don't like to kind of be like, oh, I was right. But I made a video just before the last election, which was largely a kind of like review of the Conservative Party's time in power. But at the very end, I talk a little bit about Keir Starmer. And I kind of want to look at what I said. I've not rewatched this, by the way.
It's hard to stress how impressive the complete and total
Sound is terrible, sorry about that.
implosion of the Conservative Party is. The UK sometimes gets described as having a two-party political system, given to how the Conservative and Labour parties dominate election results. But in practice, it basically has a one-party system.
Of the past 100 years, the Conservative Party has been in power for more than 70 of them. At time of recording, it looks pretty certain that same party is going to lose the next election big time. Perhaps that's already happened by the time you're watching this video, but whether the party eventually bounces back from that defeat or not, the experiments they've inflicted on the country have left damage which will last a long time. Perhaps most worrying is the extent to which some of the basic precepts of those experiments have come to be accepted by Sunak's rivals in the Labour Party. On the 4th of July, it looks very likely that it will be Labour leader Keir Starmer walking into 10 Downing Street as the new Prime Minister. Starmer has repeatedly criticised Liz Truss's disastrous reforms and Boris Johnson's lies. Nevertheless, he's completely walked back on his earlier support for a referendum on rejoining the EU, and he remains committed to an economic approach grounded in austerity.
In the same way that David Cameron once waved that note stating that there was no money left, Keir Starmer has repeatedly used Liz Truss's trashing of the economy as a reason to
Accidentally left all our bags and shot there.
scale back his promises.
His manifesto retains most of the Conservatives' cuts to welfare, has a much less ambitious approach to tackling climate change than he once promised, and suggests the party will promote further privatisation of the NHS. In fact, where you would think an election campaign would mostly revolve around the two main parties criticising each other over their specific plans for government, the current contest has largely consisted of each party criticising the other for daring to want to spend any money, which is a problem. Because after 14 years of cuts and mismanagement, the UK needs investment, and lots of it. Last year, one researcher at the Institute for Public Policy suggested that the UK had contracted a debilitating case. Do I like my own voice? I do not. This is kind of horrible. I'm sort of hating this. But I just want to get to the final part of this video because not to say that I was correct, just to say that I think we knew what the potential for all of this to happen was. Of investment phobia, in which the government refuses to invest in infrastructure, which leads to businesses not wanting to invest either.
Combine that with the country having been cut off from its closest trading partners and a crisis of trust in politics, and you end up with a country that feels so much poorer than it once did. Fixing that is going to be one hell of a task, and the challenge for Keir Starmer is that if he can't make a very real difference to people's lives pretty quickly, then he might find that his party's popularity is pretty short-lived. As many of you will know,
I said the thing, right? I said if he doesn't do a bunch of stuff to make people's lives and to kind of like cash in on that promise of change, that it wouldn't go very well. And that is kind of what has happened. Or this is exactly what has happened, right? We found ourselves... I mean, yeah, Esri saying, do you think HS2 has anything to do with the UK's investment phobia? HS2 was like the one project where we were investing in a thing. There's a bunch of problems around that in terms of allowing kind of like NIMBYs to throw the course off massively so that we had to like pay lots of money to buy different bits of land or to make there be tunnels where we could have just gone over the ground and all of this kind of stuff. But effectively, Rishi Sunak cancelled HS2 last minute as a kind of sorting the earth before he left government move, which to my mind should have come with kind of legal consequences, right? And that's not been revived. Like one of Keir Starmer's first things that he did when he got into power should have been to go, actually, we're going to rescind that, and we're going to do HS2 because it's so important that we update our rail infrastructure. One of the criticisms of HS2 is often that it was kind of like just to save 20 minutes on a train from London to Birmingham, but actually it's about the fact that the East Coast Main Line is West Coast Main Line. The capacity on it, like there is not enough space for all the trains that we need to run up and down the country, and so HS2 would have made space there. It wouldn't only have been that there were newer trains that were faster, but also that there would have been like more available track space to have more trains, both doing freight and doing passenger services as well. And so, I mean, I think what's interesting to me, to kind of wrap all of this up and round all of this off, is that Keir Starmer's biggest threat going into the next election is not the Conservative Party, but the Reform Party. So there's been a bunch of what are called MRP surveys recently, which are polls where you sort of take the result of a poll and then you kind of try and guess how that would play out in different constituencies, so that you can try and work out not only what percentage of the vote different parties are going to get at an election, but also which way each seat's going to go, and therefore how many seats they're going to have in Parliament. There's been a few of these recently, and all of which have suggested that the Reform Party are likely to make, as things stand, big gains, easily knocking the Conservative Party into second place, likely having enough seats to just form a government, and the Labour Party probably still being the second biggest party, but likely to absolutely crater in support. And this is polling that is happening just a year after the Labour Party won quite a respectable landslide election. And I think the kind of contrast between Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage is an interesting one, because on a purely practical level, they are one another's opposites. They differ in politics as well, but on a purely kind of practical level of their political careers, they are total opposites. Partly in that Keir Starmer has been in this game much less time. You know, this May would have been his 10-year anniversary of being in politics, which sounds like a long amount of time, but actually Farage has been doing this for decades and decades. But at the same time, Keir Starmer is someone who has technically won a lot of elections. If you look at his election scorecard, he's won every election he's ever entered, I want to say. Became an MP. Regained his seat in 2019. Became leader of the Labour Party. Regained his seat in 2024. Became Prime Minister of the UK. He is 5 for 5 in terms of technically winning elections. I mean, actually winning elections, right? And having power. Nigel Farage's scorecard in terms of winning elections is terrible. UKIP, really patchy in terms of its successes. Tended to win local seats, tended to do well in European elections. Very few MPs ever. 1, 2 ever MPs? Maybe 3? 2. The Reform Party currently has it's currently back to 4 now because they have some troubles there. But Nigel Farage's electoral record, has been in MEP for some time, but his electoral record in terms of actually winning elections has been atrocious. But his record in terms of having policies that he thinks are good enacted is extremely high. There's a phrase about being sort of being in government but not in power, to kind of deride people who are maybe have the technical reins of power and yet are sort of flailing around. and being battered around by external forces. And that sort of feels like Keir Starmer's career has been, to be constantly knocked back and forth by external forces and having to change his ways to fit in with those. Where Nigel Farage has been the total opposite. He's never actually won. Well, he has won, but like has rarely won seats of government, and yet has sort of been in power for at least a decade in the way that every other political party has had to follow his lead. And I don't know how the Labour Party come back from this. I don't know if Keir Starmer can at all. But even looking at the cabinet, I don't know if any of these people are genuine sort of election-winning material. They are simply not a charismatic bunch. I would say Ed Miliband is probably the Labour Party's best hope. But because the Labour right kind of have control in the Labour Party at the moment, they don't like him, and he's constantly at risk of being sacked. So, if anything, Ed Miliband is likely to have less of a job, not more of one. I think it's very likely that they will try and put Wes Streeting in, although his majority in Parliament is not, in his seat, is not strong. But you kind of go down this list and you think, Angela Rayner's reasonably kind of comes across really well, quite charismatic. But similarly, she is very much not within that clique of Labour right politicians, and therefore they are also constantly trying to kind of like push her to one side. Lammy, Cooper, Healy, like Phillipson, Kendall, like they're all in an era of anti-establishment politics and politics where we kind of like people to be charismatic and interesting and sort of like cool in some way. I don't know if any of them have got it. And that's kind of worrying, right? Because I'm not a massive fan of the Labour Party as it stands. Certainly not a fan of Nigel Farage, though. Thank you so much for watching this clip from one of my Monday night live streams. If you would like to watch more of these clips, both ad and sponsor free, then you can do so over on my premium streaming service, Nebula. Watching my videos over on Nebula really helps to support my work. Platforms like YouTube and Twitch can be a little bit funny in terms of how much revenue we get from them, and also whether or not they allow our videos to be monetized at all. Building Nebula alongside a bunch of other creators then has been a way of trying to make ourselves less reliant upon these unaccountable third-party platforms and to begin to build more reliable streams of income. If you watch our videos over on Nebula, then we both get a higher amount per view when you watch them, but also if you sign up to Nebula using my personal link, go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas, we also get a little bit of a kickback from that as well to help support me to make more and higher quality videos for you as well. So it really is win-win, and you get to watch loads of cool stuff without ads, which is great too. If you want to sign up to Nebula, then you can do so over at go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. That link again is go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. Thanks so much for watching once again, and I'll see you in a future video.